In the gleaming heart of downtown Chicago, where skyscrapers touched the clouds and justice was served daily in the marble halls of the Cook County Courthouse, Judge Patricia Reynolds had earned her reputation through 20 years of unwavering dedication to the law. Her journey from the south side of Chicago to becoming one of the most respected federal judges hadn't been easy, but her brilliance and determination had carved a path that inspired many. On this particular morning, as autumn leaves danced outside her chamber windows, she prepared to hear what seemed like a routine corporate case. Little did she know that this case would become one of the most talked-about courtroom encounters in recent history. The defendant was Richard Henderson III, CEO of Henderson Global Investments, a man whose net worth exceeded $3 billion. His company stood accused of environmental violations that had affected several low-income communities. As Judge Reynolds reviewed the case files, her clerk brought in her usual morning coffee, along with a peculiar note that had just been delivered. "Your Honor," the clerk said hesitantly, "Mr. Henderson's legal team sent this over. They're requesting a different judge for the proceedings." Judge Reynolds adjusted her reading glasses and examined the document. The reasoning cited was concerns about potential bias, but reading between the lines, the implication was clear as day. This wasn't the first time she'd faced such challenges, but something about this particular request made her straighten her spine a little more. The courtroom that morning was packed with spectators, journalists, and legal observers. The air was thick with anticipation as Henderson's legal team, consisting of 5 highly paid attorneys from prestigious firms, filed in. They carried themselves with an air of certainty that came from years of winning cases for wealthy clients. Richard Henderson III entered last, wearing a custom-made suit that probably cost more than what most people earned in months. He didn't bother to stand when Judge Reynolds entered the courtroom, a breach of basic court etiquette that sent murmurs through the gallery. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent chamber. While everyone else stood, Henderson remained seated, typing on his phone with a dismissive smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. Judge Reynolds noticed, of course. She noticed everything in her courtroom. But rather than immediately addressing the disrespect, she calmly took her seat and began reviewing the day's proceedings. 20 years on the bench had taught her that sometimes the most powerful response was a measured one. "Before we begin," she spoke with quiet authority, "I'd like to address the motion filed this morning requesting my recusal from this case." She paused, looking directly at Henderson, who finally glanced up from his phone. "The motion is denied." Henderson's lead attorney stood up immediately. "Your Honor, we have concerns about." "Counselor," Judge Reynolds interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of her 2 decades of experience, "I've reviewed your motion thoroughly. The cited reasons for recusal do not meet the legal standard required under federal law. This court's record of impartial judgment speaks for itself." That's when Henderson did something that would later make headlines across the country. He stood up, straightened his expensive jacket, and spoke without being recognized by the court. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, though his tone carried anything but respect, "I think we all know the real reason why you won't step down." The courtroom fell into a shocked silence. Even Henderson's attorneys looked uncomfortable, one of them tugging at his client's sleeve in an attempt to get him to sit down. But Henderson wasn't finished. "I've appeared before dozens of judges across this country, and I've never had to deal with such obvious." Judge Reynolds raised her hand, silencing him mid-sentence. The power in that simple gesture was palpable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. When she spoke, her words were measured and clear, carrying to every corner of the now silent courtroom. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice steady and controlled, "you are in contempt of court. Bailiff, please escort Mr. Henderson to a holding cell. We'll resume these proceedings when he's ready to show this court the respect it deserves." The bailiff moved forward as Henderson's face reddened with anger and disbelief. His attorneys scrambled to intervene, but Judge Reynolds had already made her decision. As Henderson was led away, his expensive shoes echoing on the marble floor, the message was clear: in this courtroom, justice wore no price tag. The story of what happened next would soon spread through legal circles and beyond, becoming a powerful reminder that in the halls of justice, dignity and respect weren't commodities that could be bought and sold, they were fundamental requirements, regardless of one's net worth. The news of Richard Henderson III's contempt charge spread through the city like wildfire. By sunset, every major news outlet was running the story, and social media was ablaze with discussions about the billionaire who had been sent to a holding cell by an unwavering federal judge. But inside the courthouse, away from the media frenzy, a different kind of storm was brewing. Judge Reynolds sat in her chambers, reviewing case files as if it were any other day. Her phone hadn't stopped ringing since the incident, with calls from reporters, colleagues, and even a few politicians. She let them all go to voicemail. There would be time for statements later. Right now, she had work to do. Her longtime friend and fellow judge, Robert Chen, knocked on her door. "I heard what happened," he said, closing the door behind him. "The whole building's talking about it. Are you ready for what's coming?" Judge Reynolds looked up from her papers, a slight smile crossing her face. "Robert, I've been ready for this my entire career. Some people think money puts them above the law. It's our job to remind them it doesn't." Meanwhile, in the holding cell, Henderson was getting his first taste of what it meant to be treated like an ordinary citizen. The cell was clean but bare, with only a bench and a small window letting in strips of afternoon light. His expensive suit, which had been tailored in Milan, was wrinkled from sitting on the hard bench. His phone, his lifeline to his empire, had been confiscated. Henderson's legal team was in chaos. They had never expected their client to behave so rashly, and now they were scrambling to control the damage. In a small conference room down the hall, they argued about the best course of action. "We need to file an emergency appeal," one lawyer insisted. "No, what we need is for him to apologize," another countered. "The longer he stays in that cell, the worse this looks for everyone." The lead attorney, Thomas Wright, rubbed his temples. After 30 years of practicing law, he had never seen anything quite like this. "What we need," he said firmly, "is for our client to understand that his money can't buy his way out of this one." Back in the holding cell, Henderson was beginning to realize exactly that. Hours had passed, and despite all his wealth and connections, he was still sitting on that hard bench. The reality of his situation was finally starting to sink in. A court officer appeared at the cell door. "Mr. Henderson, Judge Reynolds is willing to resume proceedings if you're ready to show proper respect to the court." Henderson stood up slowly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. Pride warred with practicality as he considered his options. After a long moment, he nodded. "I'm ready." But Judge Reynolds wasn't finished teaching her lesson about equality under the law. When Henderson was brought back to the courtroom, she had him wait while she finished hearing a small claims case. He stood there, watching as she gave the same careful attention to a dispute over a $500 car repair that she would give to his billion-dollar case. The gallery was still packed, now even more so than before. News of Henderson's return had spread quickly, and everyone wanted to see what would happen next. Among the spectators were several young law students who had rushed over from the nearby university. They watched with wide eyes, witnessing a real-life lesson in judicial authority that no textbook could provide. When Henderson's case was finally called, the change in his demeanor was visible to everyone present. Gone was the arrogant smirk, replaced by a more subdued expression. He rose when the judge entered, and when he spoke, his voice carried a note of humility that hadn't been there before. "Your Honor," he began, "I apologize for my earlier behavior. It was unacceptable and disrespectful to this court." Judge Reynolds looked at him steadily. "Mr. Henderson, this court accepts your apology. However, I want to be very clear about something. In this courtroom, and indeed in any courtroom in this country, every person is equal under the law. Your wealth, your status, your power, none of that changes the fundamental principle of justice." She paused, letting her words sink in. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the ancient radiators clicking in the background. "The contempt charge will remain on record, and you will be fined the maximum amount allowed by law. Those funds will be donated to the court's pro bono program, which helps provide legal representation to those who cannot afford it." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. Henderson's display of disrespect would now directly benefit the very people he had seemed to look down upon. As the actual case proceedings began, a subtle but significant shift had occurred in the courtroom dynamics. Henderson's lawyers presented their arguments with newfound humility, and Henderson himself paid careful attention to every word spoken, occasionally taking notes, something he had never been seen doing before. Outside the courthouse, the story was taking on a life of its own. Video clips of Henderson's earlier behavior and subsequent apology were being shared widely online. Comments poured in from people around the country, many sharing their own stories of encountering privilege and prejudice in the legal system. Judge Reynolds' chambers continued to receive messages, but now they were different in tone. Letters and emails arrived from young law students, particularly those from minority backgrounds, expressing how inspiring it was to see someone stand up to power with such dignity and grace. The day's proceedings ended with scheduling orders for future hearings. As Henderson left the courthouse, he was surrounded by reporters shouting questions. But for perhaps the first time in his life, the billionaire had nothing to say. He walked to his waiting car in silence, his expensive shoes clicking on the courthouse steps, each step a reminder that even the mightiest must bow to the law. The following days revealed that Richard Henderson III wasn't a man accustomed to losing, nor one who took public humiliation lightly. As Judge Reynolds prepared for another day in court, her clerk brought in a thick stack of newspapers. Each one carried stories about mysterious investigations into her past cases, her family, and her finances. "They're trying to dig up dirt," her clerk said worriedly, setting down the papers. "Someone's hired private investigators to look into every case you've ever handled." Judge Reynolds calmly sipped her morning coffee, her expression unchanged. 20 years on the bench," she said, "and every single decision I've made has been based on the law. Let them look." But Henderson's influence reached far beyond private investigators. That morning, Judge Reynolds received an unusual call from the chief judge of the district. "Patricia," he said, his voice carrying a note of concern, "Henderson's people have been making calls to several members of the Judicial Committee. They're pushing for an ethics investigation." "On what grounds?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. "They're claiming bias in your past rulings, particularly in cases involving wealthy defendants." "It's nonsense, of course, but they're making a lot of noise." Judge Reynolds thought about all the young lawyers and law students who had reached out to her over the past few days, sharing their own stories of facing discrimination and prejudice in the legal system. She thought about the message it would send if she backed down now. "Let them make their noise," she replied firmly. "The law speaks louder." Meanwhile, in the luxurious offices of Henderson Global Investments, Richard Henderson III was holding an emergency meeting with his board of directors. The company's stock had taken a hit after his courtroom behavior went viral, and several major clients had expressed concerns about the negative publicity. "This needs to go away," one board member insisted. "The longer this stays in the news, the more damage it does to our reputation." Henderson stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the city. His reflection showed a man whose carefully cultivated image of power and control had been shaken. "I've already apologized publicly," he said. "What more do they want?" "It's not about what they want," his PR director interjected. "It's about what this incident revealed. People are talking about privilege, about bias in the justice system. Your actions gave them a perfect example of everything they've been fighting against." Back at the courthouse, Judge Reynolds continued with her regular docket, but there was nothing regular about the atmosphere in her courtroom. Every seat was filled, not just with the usual lawyers and clients, but with observers who wanted to witness her in action. Among them were several prominent civil rights leaders who had come to show their support. During the lunch recess, Judge Reynolds received an unexpected visitor. An elderly woman named Mrs. Washington, who had been watching the proceedings, asked to speak with her. The judge's clerk was hesitant, but Reynolds agreed to the meeting. Mrs. Washington entered the chambers slowly, leaning on a worn wooden cane. "I had to come see you," she said, her voice carrying the weight of years of experience. "I was a legal secretary back in the 60s. Worked for one of the first black lawyers in this city. What you're doing now, standing up to power, it reminds me of those days." Judge Reynolds listened as Mrs. Washington shared stories of her own experiences with discrimination in the legal system. Each word added another layer of meaning to the current situation, connecting past struggles to present challenges. That afternoon, as Judge Reynolds prepared for another hearing in Henderson's case, she received word that several major news outlets were preparing to run stories about the private investigations into her background. Her phone buzzed with messages from concerned colleagues and friends, warning her about the coming media storm. But something unexpected was happening alongside these attempts to intimidate her. Social media was flooded with hashtags supporting her stance. Legal professionals from around the country were sharing their own stories of encountering privilege and prejudice in the courtroom. What had started as one judge's stand for respect was becoming a broader conversation about justice and equality. In his private office, Henderson watched these developments with growing frustration. His usual tactics of using money and influence to solve problems weren't working. In fact, they seemed to be backfiring, making him appear even more like the privileged billionaire who thought he was above the law. "We need to change strategies," his lead attorney advised. "Every move we make against Judge Reynolds just strengthens her position. The public sees her as standing up to power and privilege. They're rallying behind her." Henderson's response was interrupted by an urgent call from one of his company's biggest investors. The conversation was brief but intense. After hanging up, Henderson sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. Outside the courthouse, a small group of law students had organized a peaceful gathering in support of Judge Reynolds. They carried signs reading, "Justice has no price tag" and "Respect the bench." Local news crews interviewed several of them, including a young woman who aspired to become a judge herself. "Judge Reynolds shows us that integrity matters more than influence," she told the reporters. "She reminds us why we wanted to practice law in the first place." Inside her chambers, Judge Reynolds reviewed the latest developments in Henderson's environmental violations case. The evidence was troubling: reports of contaminated water sources in low-income neighborhoods, ignored safety regulations, and covered-up incidents. This was the real issue at hand, the reason they were all here in the first place. As the sun set over the city, casting long shadows through the courthouse windows, Judge Reynolds made a decision. She wouldn't let Henderson's attempts at intimidation distract from the actual case. The environmental violations had affected real people, real communities. They deserved justice, regardless of who stood accused. She drafted an order scheduling an emergency hearing for the following morning. The focus needed to return to the actual charges, to the communities that had been harmed. Henderson's behavior and the subsequent media circus couldn't be allowed to overshadow the fundamental pursuit of justice. As she prepared to leave for the day, Judge Reynolds noticed a small envelope that had been slipped under her door. Inside was a handwritten note from a young public defender: "Thank you for showing us that the law truly can be blind to wealth and status. You give us hope." She carefully tucked the note into her desk drawer, alongside the growing collection of similar messages she'd received. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was reminded of why she had chosen this path in the first place: to ensure that justice served everyone equally, regardless of their bank account balance or social status. The emergency hearing Judge Reynolds had scheduled revealed troubling new details about Henderson Global Investments' environmental violations. As evidence was presented in the packed courtroom, the real impact of the company's actions became clear through testimony from affected community members. A middle-aged woman named Betty Thompson took the stand, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. She had lived in the Oak Grove neighborhood for over 30 years, an area where Henderson's company had disposed of chemical waste in violation of environmental regulations. "My grandchildren can't play in their own backyard anymore," she testified, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. "The water that comes from our taps smells like chemicals. We've had to buy bottled water for everything, cooking, drinking, even brushing our teeth." As Betty spoke, Henderson shifted uncomfortably in his seat. This time, he maintained proper courtroom decorum, but his jaw tightened noticeably at each new testimony. The arrogant billionaire who had once dismissed the judge was now forced to listen to the human cost of his company's actions. During a brief recess, Judge Reynolds reviewed additional evidence in her chambers. Environmental impact reports, which Henderson's company had previously tried to suppress, showed contamination levels far exceeding legal limits. But what caught her attention was a series of internal emails suggesting that company executives had been aware of the problems for years. When the hearing resumed, the prosecution presented Dr. James Liu, an environmental scientist who had studied the affected areas. His testimony was damning. Using charts and data, he explained how the chemical waste had seeped into the groundwater, affecting not just Oak Grove but several surrounding communities. "These communities will feel the impact for generations," Dr. Liu explained, pointing to his findings. "The soil contamination alone will take decades to reverse, and that's assuming immediate action is taken to stop further damage." Henderson's legal team fought back aggressively, questioning Dr. Liu's methodology in trying to discredit his findings. But the scientist remained unshakable, his data speaking louder than their objections. During the lunch break, an unexpected visitor arrived at the courthouse. Maria Gonzalez, a community organizer from one of the affected neighborhoods, had brought photographs showing the impact of the contamination. Children playing near water that shimmered with an unnatural sheen, dead vegetation around waste disposal sites, and residents holding up bottles of discolored tap water. Judge Reynolds allowed the photographs to be entered into evidence, despite vigorous objections from Henderson's attorneys. As they were displayed in the courtroom, a hushed silence fell over the gallery. These weren't just statistics on a page anymore, they were real people, real lives affected by corporate negligence. The afternoon session brought testimony from a former Henderson Global Investments employee. David Chen had worked as an environmental compliance officer for the company before being fired after raising concerns about the waste disposal practices. "I submitted multiple reports warning about the violations," Chen testified. "Each time, I was told to modify my findings or risk losing my job. When I refused to change the data, I was terminated for poor performance." As Chen spoke, reporters in the gallery furiously took notes. This was no longer just a story about a billionaire disrespecting a judge, it was evolving into a much larger exposé of corporate environmental abuse. Henderson's lead attorney attempted to paint Chen as a disgruntled former employee, but Judge Reynolds intervened when the questioning became overly aggressive. "Counsel," she said firmly, "please limit your questions to the relevant facts of this case." The day's proceedings had shifted the narrative dramatically. Henderson was no longer just facing consequences for his courtroom behavior, he was watching his company's carefully constructed public image crumble as the truth emerged. During the afternoon recess, Judge Reynolds received an urgent message from the chief judge. Henderson's legal team had filed a motion claiming that her handling of the environmental evidence showed bias against their client. They were demanding an immediate stay of proceedings. "They're getting desperate," her clerk observed, watching her read the motion. Judge Reynolds nodded. "When the facts aren't on your side, attack the process," she said, quoting an old legal maxim. "Schedule a hearing on the motion for tomorrow morning." They're entitled to make their argument, even if it's a weak one. As the day's session concluded, Henderson hurried out of the courthouse, ignoring the reporters shouting questions. But he couldn't ignore the group of Oak Grove residents who had gathered outside, holding signs with pictures of their contaminated community. That evening, as Judge Reynolds prepared to leave her chambers, she found another note had been slipped under her door. This one was from Betty Thompson, the woman who had testified about her grandchildren's contaminated backyard. "Thank you for listening to us," the note read. "For years, we thought no one would ever hear our story. Money talks, they told us. But in your courtroom, the truth talks louder." Judge Reynolds carefully added this note to her growing collection. The case had become about so much more than one billionaire's disrespect. It had become about giving voice to those who had been silenced by power and privilege. As she drove home that evening, she passed through Oak Grove, the neighborhood at the center of the environmental case. Children were playing basketball at a community center, their parents watching from nearby benches. These were the people the justice system was meant to protect, regardless of their wealth or status. Meanwhile, in his penthouse office, Henderson stared at the latest polling data showing public opinion of his company plummeting. His phone wouldn't stop ringing, investors wanting explanations, board members demanding action, reporters seeking comments. The consequences of his actions, both in and out of the courtroom, were spiraling far beyond what he had ever anticipated. The next day would bring new challenges, but Judge Reynolds was more determined than ever to ensure that justice was served. The law was clear about environmental violations, just as it was clear about courtroom conduct. No amount of wealth or influence could change that fundamental truth. The morning newspapers painted a stark picture of Henderson Global Investments' fall from grace. Share prices had dropped by 15%, and major institutional investors were threatening to pull out unless significant changes were made. The headline that caught everyone's attention read, "From contempt to contamination, the fall of a business empire." Inside the mahogany-paneled boardroom of Henderson Global, an emergency board meeting was underway. The atmosphere was tense as board members reviewed the mounting evidence against their company. "The environmental violations alone could cost us billions," one board member said, sliding a report across the table. "And that's not counting the reputational damage." Richard Henderson III sat at the head of the table, his usual confidence replaced by visible strain. The past few weeks had transformed him from an untouchable billionaire into the face of corporate negligence and privilege. "We need to consider all options," the company's chief legal officer suggested carefully. "Including a leadership change." Henderson's head snapped up at those words. For the first time, he faced the real possibility of losing control of his own company, the empire his grandfather had started and his father had expanded. Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Judge Reynolds was dealing with a different kind of pressure. A small group of protesters had gathered outside, but not the kind anyone had expected. These were supporters of Henderson, carrying signs that questioned her impartiality and demanded her removal from the case. "Money can buy many things," she remarked to her clerk as they watched from the window, including protests, apparently. The morning's hearing began with Henderson's legal team presenting their motion for a stay of proceedings. Their argument centered on claims that Judge Reynolds was using the environmental evidence to punish their client for his earlier contempt of court. Lead attorney Thomas Wright stood before the bench, his argument carefully crafted. "Your Honor, we contend that the rapid expansion of evidence in this case, particularly following the contempt incident, suggests a pattern of bias against our client." Judge Reynolds listened patiently, her expression neutral. When Wright finished, she removed her reading glasses and addressed the courtroom. "Counselor, let me be very clear," she began. "This court's interest in environmental evidence isn't about punishment, it's about justice. The timing of these revelations has nothing to do with Mr. Henderson's contempt charge and everything to do with your client's attempts to suppress this information." She continued, her voice carrying to every corner of the silent courtroom. "The motion for a stay is denied. Furthermore, this court is ordering an independent environmental assessment of all affected areas, to be conducted by a team of experts chosen by the EPA. The gallery erupted in whispers. Henderson's attorneys huddled together, while their client sat stone-faced, his expensive tie slightly askew, a small but telling sign of his unraveling composure. During the lunch recess, an unexpected alliance was forming in the courthouse cafeteria. Community members from Oak Grove had been joined by employees from other Henderson Global facilities, all sharing stories of corporate negligence and environmental concerns. Lisa Patel, a former safety inspector at one of Henderson's chemical plants, shared documents showing similar patterns of violation at other facilities. It wasn't just Oak Grove, she explained to the group. This was systematic. The afternoon session brought more damaging testimony. Dr. Rodriguez, a public health expert, presented data showing increased rates of respiratory problems and other health issues in communities near Henderson's facilities. The correlation is undeniable, she testified, pointing to clusters of health incidents on a map. These communities are suffering the consequences of years of environmental negligence. As the evidence mounted, Henderson's demeanor continued to change. The man who had once refused to stand for a judge now sat quietly, taking notes and conferring softly with his attorneys. The transformation was noticed by everyone in the courtroom, but perhaps most significantly by Judge Reynolds herself. During a brief recess, she received an unexpected call from her mentor, retired Judge William Torres. "I saw the news," he said. "You're handling this exactly right, Patricia. Sometimes the biggest impact we can have isn't in our rulings, but in how we handle the journey to those rulings." Late that afternoon, a surprise witness took the stand. Robert Fuller, Henderson Global's former chief financial officer, had come forward with documents showing deliberate attempts to hide environmental cleanup costs from shareholders. "We were instructed to bury these expenses in other categories," Fuller testified. "When I objected, I was reminded that my severance package included a strict non-disclosure agreement." Henderson's attorneys objected vigorously, but Judge Reynolds allowed the testimony. The documents Fuller provided painted a picture of systematic deception that went beyond environmental violations. As the day's proceedings drew to a close, an unusual scene unfolded outside the courthouse. The pro-Henderson protesters had been joined by residents from affected communities, but instead of conflict, something remarkable was happening. They were talking to each other, sharing stories, finding common ground in unexpected ways. One of Henderson's supporters, after hearing Betty Thompson's story about her grandchildren's contaminated backyard, quietly removed her protest sign and joined the other side. Back in his office, Henderson faced a rebellion from within his own company. Several executive board members had called an emergency meeting for the following morning to discuss a leadership transition. In her chambers, Judge Reynolds reviewed the day's testimonies, particularly struck by the widening scope of the case. What had begun as a simple matter of courtroom conduct had unveiled a pattern of corporate behavior that affected thousands of lives. She found herself thinking about her own journey, from a young law student who faced countless obstacles to a federal judge now presiding over one of the most significant environmental cases in the state's history. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. Her clerk entered with another stack of letters from community members, each sharing their stories and thanking her for giving them a voice. "The truth has a way of coming out," she said softly, adding the letters to her growing collection. "Sometimes it just needs the right moment, the right catalyst." As night fell over the city, the lights in Henderson's office remained on, his silhouette visible against the skyline. In homes across Oak Grove and other affected communities, families gathered to discuss the day's developments, hope beginning to replace years of resignation. The case had become more than a story about a judge standing up to a billionaire. It had become a revelation of how money and power had been used to silence communities and hide corporate misconduct. But more importantly, it had become a story about the power of dignity, respect, and unwavering commitment to justice. The emergency board meeting at Henderson Global Investments began at dawn. The morning sun cast long shadows across the conference room as board members filed in, their faces grave with the weight of decisions to come. Richard Henderson III sat alone at the head of the table, his usual entourage of advisors notably absent. "The numbers don't lie," the chief financial officer began, distributing thick folders of financial reports. "Our stock has dropped 30% since this began. Major clients are jumping ship. The environmental cleanup costs alone could bankrupt us if we don't act quickly." Henderson watched as his father's oldest friend and longest-serving board member, George Sullivan, stood up. "Richard," he said, his voice heavy with decades of experience, "your grandfather built this company on trust. Your father expanded it through innovation. But under your leadership, we've lost both." The words hit Henderson like physical blows. He looked around the table, searching for allies among the faces he'd known for years, but found only stern expressions and averted eyes. "We're calling for an immediate leadership transition," Sullivan continued. "The board has voted. It's time to step aside, Richard." Meanwhile, at the courthouse, Judge Reynolds was reviewing new evidence that had emerged overnight. Former employees from Henderson Global facilities across the country had come forward, each with similar stories of environmental violations and corporate cover-ups. Her clerk entered with the morning's newspapers. "The business sections are calling it the Henderson Revelation," she said, laying out the papers. "Every major outlet is covering the story." Judge Reynolds picked up one of the papers, noting how the narrative had evolved. What had started as a story about a billionaire's disrespect for the court had become an exposé of corporate environmental crimes that spanned decades. The morning's proceedings began with a surprise announcement from Henderson's legal team. Thomas Wright stood before the bench, his usual confidence replaced by a solemn demeanor. "Your Honor, in light of recent developments, my client would like to address the court." The gallery buzzed with whispers as Richard Henderson III approached the podium. Gone was the arrogant billionaire who had once refused to stand for a judge. In his place stood a man who had been humbled by the very system he had once dismissed. "Your Honor," he began, his voice slightly hoarse, "I've spent my entire life believing that money and power were the only things that mattered. I treated this court with disrespect because I thought my wealth put me above the law." He paused, glancing at the packed gallery where community members from Oak Grove sat alongside his own employees. "This morning, I was removed as CEO of Henderson Global Investments. The company my grandfather founded, that my father built, it's no longer mine to control. And the truth is, I deserve this outcome." The courtroom fell silent as Henderson continued. "The environmental violations we're accused of, they happened under my watch. I knew about them. I chose to ignore them because addressing them would have cost money, would have affected our profits." Judge Reynolds watched carefully as Henderson spoke, noting the genuine remorse in his voice. "I can't undo the damage my company has caused to these communities," he said, turning to face the Oak Grove residents. "But I can take responsibility for it. Today, I'm announcing the creation of a $5 billion environmental cleanup fund, to be administered by an independent board that includes community representatives." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Betty Thompson, who had testified about her contaminated backyard, wiped tears from her eyes as Henderson continued. "Furthermore, I'm voluntarily providing all internal documents related to our environmental practices to the EPA and state authorities. No more cover-ups. No more hiding behind armies of lawyers." Judge Reynolds allowed the gallery's reaction to settle before speaking. "Mr. Henderson," she said, her voice carrying its usual measured authority, "this court acknowledges your statement and the steps you're proposing to take. However, you understand that this does not exempt you or your company from legal consequences?" "Yes, Your Honor," Henderson replied. "For the first time in my life, I truly understand that justice isn't something that can be bought or sold. It's something that must be faced, regardless of one's wealth or status." As the morning session continued, environmental experts presented detailed plans for the cleanup effort. Dr. Liu, who had testified earlier about the contamination, now shared his recommendations for soil and water restoration. During the lunch recess, an impromptu gathering formed in the courthouse plaza. Community activists, former Henderson employees, and even some of the company's shareholders came together to discuss the path forward. Maria Gonzalez, the community organizer who had brought the contamination photos, spoke with reporters. "This isn't just about winning a case," she said. "It's about restoring hope to communities that had lost faith in the system." Back in the courtroom, Judge Reynolds announced the formation of an oversight committee to monitor the cleanup efforts. This committee will include environmental experts, community representatives, and court-appointed monitors, she explained. Regular reports will be filed with this court to ensure all commitments are being met. As the day progressed, more details emerged about the scope of Henderson Global's environmental violations. The company's new leadership team, led by interim CEO Patricia Chen, pledged full cooperation with investigators and promised sweeping reforms. Late in the afternoon, Judge Reynolds received a hand-delivered letter from Henderson. Unlike his previous attempts at communication, this one wasn't written by lawyers or PR experts. "Your Honor," it read, "when I first entered your courtroom, I saw only what I wanted to see. I let my prejudices blind me to your wisdom and authority. You could have just punished me for contempt and moved on. Instead, you forced me to see the true impact of my actions. You made me face not just the law, but justice itself. For that, I am genuinely grateful." As she finished reading, Judge Reynolds thought about all the young lawyers and law students who had been following this case. The lesson it taught went far beyond environmental regulations or courtroom conduct. It was about the fundamental principle that justice serves everyone equally. The sun was setting as she left her chambers that evening, casting an orange glow through the courthouse windows. Outside, cleanup crews were already beginning preliminary assessments in Oak Grove, marking the start of what would be a long but hopeful journey toward restoration. The case that had begun with a billionaire's contempt had transformed into something much more significant, a reminder that the law, when properly applied, could be a powerful force for positive change, regardless of wealth or status. In the weeks that followed Henderson's public admission, the impact of the case rippled through the corporate world. Business schools across the country were already using it as a case study in corporate responsibility and environmental justice. But in Oak Grove and the other affected communities, the focus was on more immediate concerns. Early morning sunlight filtered through the trees as Betty Thompson stood in her backyard, watching environmental assessment teams take soil samples. The cleanup effort was finally underway, marking the beginning of a new chapter for her community. "My grandchildren might actually be able to play here again," she said to a court-appointed monitor who was overseeing the work. "After all these years of being told nothing could be done, it's almost hard to believe." At the courthouse, Judge Reynolds was reviewing the first batch of progress reports from the Environmental Cleanup Committee. The detailed documents showed promising initial results, though they also revealed the true extent of the contamination. It was worse than anyone had initially suspected. Her clerk knocked on the door, carrying a newspaper. "You might want to see this," she said, handing over the business section. The headline read, "Henderson Global Announces Historic Environmental Justice Initiative." The article detailed how the company, under its new leadership, was going beyond the court-mandated cleanup. They were establishing a nationwide program to audit their environmental practices and actively work with communities affected by their operations. Meanwhile, Richard Henderson III was doing something he'd never done before, listening. He had begun visiting the communities his company had harmed, not with an entourage of lawyers and PR specialists, but alone, sitting in people's homes and hearing their stories. In Oak Grove's community center, he sat across from Maria Gonzalez, the community organizer who had fought for years to bring attention to the contamination. "You know what hurt the most?" she said, her voice steady. "It wasn't just the pollution. It was being dismissed, being treated like our lives didn't matter because we weren't rich or powerful." Henderson nodded, the weight of her words visible in his expression. "I spent my whole life measuring worth in dollars," he replied. "It took losing everything to understand what really matters." Back in the courtroom, the case was entering its final phases. Judge Reynolds had to determine the full extent of penalties and oversight measures. The gallery was packed as environmental experts presented their final assessments. Dr. Liu returned to the stand with updated findings. "The cleanup is progressing faster than expected," he reported, largely due to the unprecedented level of resources being committed. "However, we're also discovering that the contamination spread further than our initial estimates suggested." During a brief recess, Judge Reynolds received an unexpected visit from the chief judge. "You've handled this perfectly," he said. "This case is going to be referenced in law schools for generations." "It's not about making legal history," she replied, adjusting her reading glasses. "It's about making things right." The afternoon session brought testimony from Patricia Chen, Henderson Global's new CEO. Her presentation outlined sweeping changes in the company's environmental policies and corporate governance. "We're not just cleaning up past mistakes," Chen explained. "We're restructuring our entire approach to ensure this never happens again. Every major decision now includes environmental impact assessments and community input." As she listened, Judge Reynolds thought about how far the case had come from that first day when Henderson had refused to stand. The transformation wasn't just in him or his company, it was in how corporate responsibility was being redefined. The next day, an unusual scene unfolded in the courthouse plaza. Community members from Oak Grove had organized a gathering to share their stories of hope and recovery. Among them was David Chen, the former environmental compliance officer who had been fired for raising concerns. "I've been hired back," he announced to the group. "Not just to my old position, but as head of a new environmental compliance division. They're actually listening now." Inside her chambers, Judge Reynolds was preparing her final ruling. The case had evolved far beyond its original scope, becoming a landmark decision that would influence corporate environmental responsibility for years to come. She thought about all the letters she'd received throughout the case, from community members, from law students, from corporate executives inspired to examine their own practices. Each one represented a ripple effect of change. Late that afternoon, an environmental justice conference being held at the local law school invited her to speak. Standing at the podium, she looked out at a room full of eager faces, many of them young law students who had followed the case closely. "Justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing," she told them. "It's about creating positive change. Sometimes, it takes a dramatic event to open our eyes to long-standing problems. But what matters most is what we do with that awareness." In Oak Grove, the first phase of cleanup was showing tangible results. The water running from Betty Thompson's taps was clear again. The soil in her backyard was being treated. Children were starting to play outside again, though under careful supervision until the cleanup was complete. Richard Henderson III, no longer a CEO but perhaps for the first time truly a leader, had established a permanent office in Oak Grove to oversee the cleanup efforts personally. The man who once couldn't be bothered to stand for a judge now regularly sat through community meetings, taking notes and ensuring every concern was addressed. As the sun set over the city, Judge Reynolds stood at her chamber window, watching the cleanup crews pack up for the day in the distance. The case had become more than a legal proceeding, it had become a catalyst for change, a reminder that justice, when properly served, could transform not just individuals but entire communities. Her clerk brought in one final piece of mail, a letter from a young girl in Oak Grove. Inside was a simple drawing of people playing in a park, with the words, "Thank you for making our playground safe again," written in crayon. This, she thought, was the true measure of justice, not in headlines or legal precedents, but in the real, tangible improvements in people's lives. The case that had begun with a show of disrespect had evolved into a powerful demonstration of how the law could serve as a force for positive change when applied with wisdom, dignity, and unwavering commitment to justice. 1 year after the case that had changed everything, Judge Patricia Reynolds stood in the newly renovated Oak Grove Community Park. The autumn leaves danced around her feet as she watched children playing on clean, safe ground, a sight that would have been unthinkable just 12 months ago. The park's renovation was part of the larger transformation that had swept through the community. The $5 billion environmental cleanup fund had done more than just remove contamination, it had restored hope to places that had long been forgotten by those in power. Today was the official commemoration ceremony for the completed first phase of the cleanup effort. Residents from all the affected communities had gathered, along with environmental experts, corporate representatives, and media from across the country. Betty Thompson, now the head of the Community Oversight Committee, took the podium first. "A year ago, we were afraid to let our children play outside," she said, her voice carrying across the crowd. "Today, our soil tests clean. Our water runs clear. But more than that, we've learned that justice is possible, even when facing the most powerful opponents." The crowd's attention turned as Richard Henderson III approached the podium. The past year had changed him visibly. Gone was the expensive suit and arrogant demeanor, replaced by business casual attire and a humbler bearing. "When I first stood in Judge Reynolds' courtroom, I was a man who thought money could buy anything: respect, justice, even the right to pollute communities that I deemed less important than my profit margins," he began. "I couldn't have been more wrong." He paused, looking out at the faces of people whose lives his company had affected. "This past year has taught me that true wealth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in the health of our communities, in the laughter of children playing in clean parks, in the dignity of people being heard and respected." The environmental cleanup had become a model for corporate responsibility nationwide. Other companies, seeing the positive changes and community goodwill generated by Henderson Global's transformation, had begun proactively addressing their own environmental issues. Dr. Liu, who had been instrumental in the cleanup effort, presented the latest environmental impact report. "The restoration progress has exceeded our most optimistic projections," he announced, displaying charts showing the dramatic improvement in soil and water quality. "What we're seeing here is proof that with proper resources and commitment, even severe environmental damage can be reversed." Maria Gonzalez, still actively organizing for environmental justice, spoke about the ripple effects of the case. "We've had communities from across the country reaching out to us, learning from our experience," she shared. "This case didn't just help Oak Grove, it's becoming a blueprint for environmental justice everywhere." Judge Reynolds listened to each speaker, reflecting on how a moment of disrespect in her courtroom had catalyzed such profound change. When it was her turn to speak, she approached the podium with the same quiet dignity that had defined her throughout the case. "A courtroom is more than just a room where laws are enforced," she began. "It's where we, as a society, decide what kind of world we want to live in." This case reminded us that justice isn't about wealth or power, it's about doing what's right, about treating every person with dignity, about protecting our communities and our future. She looked out at the gathered crowd, the children playing, the elderly residents who had lived with contamination for decades, the young activists who had fought for change, and even the corporate executives who had learned valuable lessons. "But the true heroes of this story aren't in the courtroom," she continued. "They're right here, the community members who never gave up, the whistleblowers who risked their careers to expose the truth, the scientists who documented the damage, and yes, even those who, when confronted with their mistakes, chose to make things right." The ceremony concluded with the planting of a new tree in the park, a symbol of the community's renewal. As Betty Thompson's grandchildren helped shovel the soil, their grandmother no longer had to worry about them being exposed to contamination. Later that afternoon, Judge Reynolds walked through the Oak Grove neighborhood with David Chen, now the successful head of Henderson Global's Environmental Compliance Division. The changes were visible everywhere: new air quality monitoring stations, restored wetlands, and homes that had been repaired from environmental damage. "You know what the most significant change is?" Chen asked, gesturing to a group of residents chatting with some Henderson Global employees. "It's the relationship between the company and the community. We're not adversaries anymore, we're partners in maintaining this progress. As the day drew to a close, a small gathering was held in the community center. Richard Henderson III, who now spent most of his time working with environmental justice initiatives, shared his plans for expanding the cleanup model to other communities facing similar challenges. "This isn't the end of the story," he said, speaking to the gathered residents. "It's just the beginning. What happened here in Oak Grove has shown us what's possible when we prioritize people over profits, when we face our mistakes and work to correct them." Judge Reynolds' clerk, who had been with her throughout the case, presented her with a bound collection of letters, photographs, and news articles documenting the year's transformation. "Your Honor," she said, "this case has already become required reading in law schools across the country." "The legal precedent is important," Judge Reynolds replied, "but what matters most is right here, in the restored communities, in the cleaned-up parks, in the knowledge that the system can work for everyone, regardless of their wealth or status." As night fell over Oak Grove, the lights in the park illuminated families enjoying their renewed space. Children played on clean grass, elderly residents sat on new benches sharing stories, and the sound of community life filled the air. The case that had begun with a billionaire's refusal to stand for a judge had ended with him standing alongside the very communities he had once dismissed. It had transformed not just Oak Grove, but the very nature of corporate environmental responsibility. In her chambers the next morning, Judge Reynolds found a new batch of letters on her desk, this time from community leaders across the country, asking for advice on achieving similar transformations in their own neighborhoods. She smiled, knowing that the impact of this case would continue to ripple outward, reminding everyone that justice, when served with dignity and determination, had the power to transform not just individuals, but entire communities and corporations. The story of the judge and the billionaire had become something much more, a testament to the enduring power of dignity, respect, and the unwavering pursuit of justice for all.